So in the last couple of years, we've had a seismic shift going on to higher inflation, higher interest rates, and we've all gone through the pain of the last 15 months as virtually every asset class has been going through an adjustment process. And prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it was about, transitory versus persistent inflation and things like that. Now it's really shifting to how the world's changed in a much more meaningful way. So I want to spend some time today talking about a wargaming exercise that was done by the Centers for Strategic and International Studies. But I also want to talk about the politics of what's going on around the world, particularly around some climate issues, and then talk about where we're putting money to work in this environment. So I'll just jump right into this. There's been a series of natural disasters around the world, and this is creating some big problems. And if you go back to '99 in Turkey, when we lost 17,000 people in that earthquake, a young politician came in and was riding that public anger, and he became PM, and that was Erdogan. And now he's in a situation where he's dealing with the same situation. They're talking, this polling is pretty close in the election right now, and they're already talking about postponing the upcoming election. So democracy under pressure again. In Pakistan, you have their current political situation, which is exacerbated by the floods that have come along. You have inflation at a 48-year high. The IMF can't get a deal done with them. The World Bank is changing leaders and what their role is going to be. And now you have standoffs in the street that are really civil war potential like, so another messy situation. So when we have these natural disasters, you have to be thinking about what may come after, and political upheaval is one of them. And then you go around the rest of the world and you have Serbia threatening to restart the Balkan War. Argentina election is coming up, and Kirchner went back the president that she supported. That creates a whole different dynamic down there. The Moldavia government stepped down, and then you have the US, Germany, Israel, Iran, and France all in various states of disarray around politics. So it's not a great situation to set up coming into this. So about 3 months ago, the U.S. put out their U.S. National Security Strategy Plan. It comes out pretty regularly. I think it's every 2 years they do this, but they talked about the twin challenges in the plan. And one is outcompeting our rivals to reshape the world order, which is exactly what China is trying to do with us right now as the primary. But the other part is to tackle the shared challenges that we have, whether it's climate, food, health, energy, and national security. And these are at odds with each other in so many different ways. And that's a big part of the tension. And that's the US vision and kind of the Western vision of how we see things. Japanese national security strategy, it's read very similar to ours. And I think that the alignments of the like-minded nations is going to continue the democratic versus autocratic nations and how that plays out. But right now, we really only have one rival who could replace us and is keen on replacing us, and that would be China. And I'd say the last thing for the U.S., in addition to the twin challenges, we have the big challenge of our political divisiveness and the social unrest and the worsening financial conditions here. And we have to remember that leadership's not guaranteed. You have to keep earning it. And if you go back through history, you can see all the leading nations that have been left by the side of the road because they forgot that. It's something we really have to keep an eye on as we're doing this political infighting right now. But the CSIS came out with their report, and they did what would happen if China invented an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. And they ran the scenario multiple times, and in most cases, the US, Japan, and Taiwan defeated a conventional assault. China did not take Taiwan, and really everyone came out on the short end of the stick here. There's, from the wargaming, there was no winning in this. Everyone loses. And I think the challenge you have right now is with Xi getting his third term, they've become much more aggressive about this reunification of issue. And as Rob Lee and others have reminded us, most Chinese believe China and Taiwan are one nation. So this has a different dynamic than, say, Russia and Ukraine, although Russia believes it's one nation, Ukraine has a very different view on that. I think we're in a different scenario here, and the challenges are much bigger. And I think as a result of that, the world needs a very specific plan. We had from 14 to 22 to get a plan in place for Ukraine, which we didn't do. If we don't use this time to get a plan in place, a contingency plan for what's going to happen going forward with Taiwan, we're making a huge mistake, because we have to be preparing now for future conflicts. You can't wait. And we are not in a position in the U.S. right now, I don't believe, with our armament to engage in a major war beyond what we're involved in already. So we need to get different weaponry. We need to get a different mindset in our military. And we need to think about the use of unconventional weaponry and how we're bringing drones and the like. And the Ukrainian war has given you a good sense of how war is changing, but there's still a lot more that's coming in the next battle. So what happened when they did the simulation? So the war starts the same way virtually every time. They do, China launches missile assaults, tries to wipe out as much of the Navy and Air Force of Taiwan as they can. They get most of the planes on the ground in the first wave. They wipe out significant numbers of that. They then encircle the island with their Navy, and they start to send troops in by air and sea. In the baseline scenario, that doesn't work very well. The assault flounders, you have logistic challenges, and the losses in personnel are quite heavy. So you have to go into it thinking you're going to have some big problems. For Taiwan to succeed in defending themselves, they have to hold the line. They have to be ready and able to stop the onslaught, similar to the way the Ukrainians really held the line with Russia. The other thing, there's no Ukrainian model for Taiwan. What we mean by that is you can't choose to just send armaments in. You have to actually go all in. You have to put people on the ground. You have to commit your full capacity, or you're not going to be able to slow down what's an inevitable takeover of Taiwan by China. We have to be able to use our naval bases in Japan, but also in Guam. And we really have to get to the Chinese fleet very quickly, and we have to do it from a distance, because we have run the risk of losing significant Air Force capabilities as well, again, on the ground, because of the ability to strike from distance. So the real question is, can China get it going, and can they capture the airfields and ports and keep them operating? And what's left of Taiwan if they do invade that makes it worth invading? And you can see the losses of ships and aircraft are high for both sides. I think the ship issue around China is when you're trying to do a siege on water, you're pretty much open to getting attacked pretty well. The airplanes, the aircraft losses, again, tend not to be dogfights. It's much more getting them before they can take off. So this is pretty significant losses on top of militaries that have been either underinvested in or drawn down over time. So that's there's a lot of issues around what's going on there. So if you're going to go, and how you avoid a Pyrrhic victory is you have to actually have a real good plan that is not ideologic, but it's based on political and economic and military realities. You can't plan on striking the mainland, because that gets you into a full escalation of nuclear. Everyone has to acknowledge there's going to be massive casualties in this fight. The island isn't that big to begin with. The fighting is going to be very close up front. And they'll also, with the use of drones now and other advanced technologies, you can inflict a lot more damage a lot more quickly. So you need to know that. And then the Taiwanese military has to be set up for defending their land in a way that you have to really plan on digging in and creating the kind of defense system inside a country while you're running your regular country. It's not easy to do. So we have to get much deeper into Asia-Pac region with our bases. We actually have to help Japan and other nations get fortified up. We have to really rethink what we're buying and how we're buying the stuff we're getting, and where are we sourcing things from? How do we make sure we have all the necessary resources to do it? And we really have to avoid getting too deep into And we have to avoid getting into the Chinese mainland because I think that's when all hell lets loose and you end up in a really bad spot. So in that kind of a backdrop, where would we put money today? It goes back into the industrials and materials sector because there's this actual threat of war, but then you have the economic war that is underway right now. And that's starting with getting the materials needed to protect your nation and other nations from aggressors. And if the war in Ukraine taught the West anything, it's defense is needed, and it's needed in a material way for protective purposes rather than aggressive purposes. And I think the mindset has been with ESG and other investments that the defense industry is about killing people as opposed to about protecting national security and protecting your borders. So I think that's one area. I think the industrial steel, copper, rare earths, all the things that are needed to be in the high-tech area, every country is going to be pushing it up. One of the issues with China right now that they're very focused on patents because they might not win the near-term battle in tech advances, but if they can win the patent battle, then they'll be where the Qualcomms of the world are now, sitting at that point in the value chain where they'll be so critical that they'll be a dominant player. So it's going to come down to you want to own the things that are going to provide you the ability to stay as an independent nation and to be thriving in a very difficult environment. We still think that telecommunication and technology areas are going to still be major areas for it. Data continues to grow, and this energy transition is going to be, it's all connected. And that's the thing is you can't get away from renewables to the energy transition to technology advances to national security. They're all integrated. So you really have to be thinking about the value chain through here and forget about the market and think about the businesses that are going to win. In healthcare, we have continue to have this issue globally. We're aging very fast. The wars are going to put greater strains on systems for their labor forces. That's going to mean more robotics, but it also means people are going to be staying in the workforce longer. So you're going to have biotech plays that allow people to do that. And then an environment where things are going to get potentially pretty sloppy over the next several years, you want to make sure you're dealing with the strong balance sheet companies with quality dividends, because this is going to be I think a low growth, low return environment where there'll be pockets of massive opportunity hidden by the fears about the overall markets themselves. So I'm going to stop there. And Hamlet's, I saw was on, so far more knowledgeable about the whole national security setup. So if he wants to weigh in, that would be great as well.
Hey, comments, questions? Stephen? Stephen, do people have a sense that reunification with Taiwan is on Z's bucket list?
Well, it's been a stated objective for some time of his. So yeah, I think that's his crown jewel as far as he's concerned.
So it's not if, it's when.
Likely.
Okay.
That's been the case since, the first Taiwan Strait missile crisis in the 50s. I mean, ever since Jiang Jieshi went to Taiwan, China has wanted to move back into Taiwan ever since liberation. So but again, it's a long game, man. I'll stop there for now, but I just wanted to weigh in on that. This has always been the goal of mainland China. Any Chinese citizen of the mainland sees Taiwan as part of China. There's no further discussion about that.
So, Stephen, do you think that Warren Buffett sold Taiwan Semiconductor because of what's going on with Taiwan, you think? Because it's still a cheap stock.
I think he was worried about it's potentially cheap, but it's got a high multiple. Right? It's not that cheap. And you can find, in the same space, you can find stuff with a lot less risk.
Okay.
So if you want to play the chip space, you can do it without having to take on that risk. It's a great company, though, so it's a question of, I think sometimes people want to just avoid the headline risk, too.
How dependent are we on Taiwan and China now?
I think we and they are equally dependent on each other.
Hey, Bar, I need to use the restroom.
Understand that.
You guys are
This is Hamlet. I think the
obviously
points
next to
China and Taiwan are definitely spot on. I think there's two other factors that I think we need to overlay on this analysis. The biggest one, I think, is the demographic crunch and pressure that China is about to go under. Anywhere from 25 to 35% of the population is dying off in the next 10 to 15 years. Plus, what you're starting to see is some significant manufacturing flight out of China. That's going to put additional pressures on what I think is already a fragile Chinese economy. So I think if you look at if or when China grabs Taiwan or reaches for Taiwan, I actually thought they were going to try to do it under the Biden administration. I actually now think that Xi is taking some copious notes in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. I think the stuff you just laid out in terms of the difficulty of invading a well-armed island are spot on. I think Xi, if he had his druthers, would probably rather take over Taiwan, similar to what he did with Hong Kong, which is a slow straggle or a strangle and a squeeze versus by brute force. What would change that, though, is if these demographic issues that China is running into and these macroeconomic issues and demographic issues that China is running into, that's going to cause some significant internal pressure. That overlaid with the shock that's going to hit China from a food scarcity standpoint could cause some significant dissent, or lack of a better word, revolt's probably too strong of a word, but a significant amount of noise inside China. And if Xi does need an external force or an external threat to calm the masses and galvanize forces behind him, that's when I think an aggressive move into Taiwan makes more sense. But this is a long game. I think you're starting to see a complete rebalancing of geopolitics. I think you're starting to see a complete rebalancing of supply chains as well.
Yeah, I think the economics are going to play a big part in the geopolitical angle, as you said, and the demographic issue is a big one. That their demographic cliff is high, which is actually could be helpful for their economy. Unfortunately, if they had a lot of the aging progress the way they could use it to progress. I mean, they need to get younger fast. They also have the other issue you pointed out, Alec, which is I think is a really important one, is the flight of capital and expertise that's going on is real. And you can only lose so much talent for so long.
And that's happening to Russia in a big way.
Big way.
Yeah,
That's where the
those are,
sanctions
look, there's,
and other stuff play out.
yeah.
Alec?
So I was saying the demographic flight is real, but you also got to realize China is not a monolithic nation of 1.4 billion people who are beholden to the Communist Party. You have probably a good 30-40% of the country that still lives in the rural parts of the country. So that's 300 to 400 million people that couldn't give a rip what's happening geopolitically, as long as they're getting fed and taken care of. As far as the people that have moved into China, I would argue out of the 700 or 800 million people that are moving into the urban centers, you probably have about 2 to 20 million people, and that's being generous, that are true card-carrying believers of the Communist Party. And I think the minute that social covenant with the people starts breaking down, and the reason people have dealt with all this bullshit is the promise of stability. But once you have the economy, I think, feel the pressures I think it's going to, you have a significant risk of China, which has never been a unified monolithic country, having some significant issues internally. That, I think, like I said, is going to be the precursor you look at of whether or not he takes aggressive action against Taiwan.
Hamlet, you could speak for 2 hours straight on this topic, so I want to keep it going. Wanda?
Stephen, I wanted to ask a question regarding the war games that you presented. So I haven't studied in West Point at all. It was said, though, at the beginning of the Ukrainian war, that this is the last 20th century war, the Russia-Ukraine war. And what you presented to me is pretty much traditional war game, except we have ships, not tanks, we have assault. So my question is, are there any other scenarios in play that include more of the socio-techniques, more of the high-tech interference in this war game?
I think
Just
they're,
to speculate.
yeah, they're using the same, it was interesting, for part of the war game scenario, the attack, the amphibious assault, they actually were using part of Normandy's invasion as the basis for how an amphibious assault would take hold. But I think, Juan, you bring up a good point that the war in Ukraine right now has elements of traditional warfare with very non-traditional elements too. The use of drones in particular picking up, and some of the other weaponry, I think, is a big change, as well as the cyber attacks and other communications jamming and other issues that they're using to track and get an edge. So I think it's a much more sophisticated type of war that you're seeing than the World War II kind of in previous battles. This is a very high-tech one, so it's got new age and old war techniques going on.
It's also two different countries. Russia is fighting an old style war, which is throw manpower and attrition at an adversary. Ukraine is actually fighting a much more technologically sophisticated war. I would look for China, if they do go kinetic with Taiwan, to deploy a significant arsenal of a variety of techniques, to include debilitating cyber attacks, not only on Taiwan, but a real scenario, if China is going to move on Taiwan, is to probably precede that with a series of debilitating cyber attacks, not only against Taiwan, but potentially against the West, to distract us so they can move in and try to slow down our response.
So Hamlet, where are we with weaponry to engage in another conflict right now? My sense is we are woefully unprepared.
We are, and this is a hypothetical, but part of this whole rearming Ukraine or arming Ukraine, what it's doing is we're not sending pallets of cash over to Ukraine for them to buy arms from us. What we're sending to Ukraine are pallets of older, call it global war on terror weaponry that we don't necessarily need anymore. So that's allowing the Defense Department or defense contractors to kind of clear out their coffers, take those credits and use that to rearm and modernize their weaponry. I mean, if a war broke out today, I think we'd be in bad shape in terms of trying to fight it from a conventional standpoint. The question really comes down to is who's got the better hole cards in this case. I'm talking about hypersonics and true kinetic capabilities from an autonomous standpoint. I think both China and the US are downplaying that capability because you don't want to show your strength going into a battle.
So just some other questions, Michael, Joel, and Bill.
So I actually deal with U.S. Special Operations Command is a vendor. One thing that I think folks are missing is non-kinetic engagements. And the Army, for example, last year, I participated in some exercises with them. And if we look at what's happening in Moldova today, that's a good example. There's a significant risk of the current regime falling in a regime friendly to Russia taking its place. Looking at China versus the US in regards to Taiwan, both powers have been, shall we say, seeding or preparing the battleground, particularly in terms of non-kinetic efforts and preparing for cyber engagements. So it really is complex. As far as Taiwan, I think that the near-term most likely scenario is an unanticipated series of events triggering an invasion attempt rather than a planned, we're going to do it on this date and in this time frame. Face is important, right? So even something like this recent balloon incident could spin out of control.
Cool.
Yeah, I just want to say that this kind of infatuation or kind of focus on a hot war between China and Taiwan takes our eye off the ball that we're in the midst of a pretty significant Cold War with China now. And this is not something to kind of take lightly. China, I don't see an invasion of Taiwan happening anytime soon. And I think what we have to be ready for is, you know, when Trump created the tariffs with China, Chinese firms moved to Vietnam, Cambodia, they set up shop there. When supply chain issues started to happen, Chinese companies moved to Mexico. Now they're manufacturing in Mexico, so they have even better access to the US market. What Chinese want and what Chinese companies want, and really what the Chinese government wants, is access to our markets, in my mind. And they're going to continue to play that kind of game, really looking at the one belt, one road policy, and looking at that writ large throughout the world, and looking where Chinese people are, thinking about the Confucius Institutes from a few years ago. It's really more Cold War soft power plays with occasional flare-ups that we're going to see. But if we spend so much time focusing on war games, we're going to get encircled in a way, and we're going to miss the things that are slowly happening like a boiled frog that are going to shift the focus of geopolitics.
Thanks, Joel. Never heard boiled frog in a while. Bill?
Sure. Question about the end game for all this, because if in fact China is trying to mirror the Hong Kong situation, it seems as though they got the political victory there, but there's all the good stuff, if you will, of Hong Kong has slowly been fading. So in a sense, yes, it's territorial, yes, it's political. Do you see something like that for Taiwan? I mean, it seems a little puzzling at the end of the day. And what do I know?
Well, maybe that's going to be answered when we turn it over to you, Rob, for further deeper discussion. But Paul, what's your comment question before we do that?
I just had a quick question for Stephen. Like a company like Tesla, where it has large operations in China, what happens in this situation? Those just get absorbed by China, and they're no longer part of like the U.S. company. I mean, Tesla's just a noteworthy example. I'm sure there's dozens of companies like that have large operations in China.
I think it's a great question. I think it depends on how it plays out. But every company right now is in a kind of, beware of what you're getting into. You've seen, if you want to look at what can go wrong, just go to South America and look at the energy companies' situations there in the past. So you actually have to go in knowing you're going to be in the market for what reasons you're going to be in, and be prepared to be out of it, or to be passing off that part of the business onto a Chinese partner at some discounted level.
So we have a tradition at lunch. Peter, hold on, just going to transition. We'll get to your questions. We talk about fun facts, but we also talk about what scares and excites us. And I think this came up at one of those lunches, Rob, where people were worried about, I don't know if it was about China, Taiwan specifically, but occasionally, sort of like when we talk about blockchain and we give the question to Bill Deichler and he spends 20 minutes explaining it to us. We were lucky to have Rob Lee, who has been trading in the semiconductor space, obviously has to have a point of view on Taiwan. We also, by the way, have a new guest. By tradition, everyone introduces themselves. This comes from Amit Berman, whom we know from West Grove in London. So Tom, because you have some Taiwan experience too.
Yeah, my name is Tom Kirkwood. My family, I was born in Thailand and brought up in Asia, 20 years in mainland China. and just have both investment, personal, spiritual interests in Asia, and have spent a couple years in Taiwan along the way. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm representing myself, but also I'm partnering in a company called West Grove, which is a small family office headquartered in London with a tiny office in Singapore. Thank you so much for having me, Mark. Yeah. And I'm happy to participate here. Thank you.
So maybe Rob, you can sort of set the stage for maybe both your backgrounds and your perspectives on this.
Sure. Maybe I'll just introduce myself a little bit. You know, I think most of you guys already know who I am, and I'll introduce Daniel.
Assuming I'm nothing.
Okay. Rob Lee, born and raised in mainland China, moved to the U.S. Almost 20 years ago from college, and pretty much spent my entire career in New York. Initially was investment banker at Credit Suisse, moved to private equity side, Morgan Stanley Couple Partners. So did mostly buyout and growth investments in both U.S. and Asia, and that was really my first exposure to Taiwan business back then. Moved to the public equity side 2015. Initially was a Tiger company called SlatePass, running their tech investments there, and then moved to another JP Morgan asset management spinoff in end of 2015. Still running our global tech consumer industrial investments and a lot of exposure to Asia, both China and Taiwan, including semiconductor. I recently spun off from my old shop and launched a new firm, still the same public equity strategy, very fundamental driven. Still very much focused on three sectors of NOL, tech, consumer, industrials, including semiconductors. And obviously, given the political climate, U.S., China, and Taiwan is a very hot issue right now. And I'm sure a lot of you saw Warren Buffett got into TSMC, which is one of the largest fabs. You know, most of your phones like go through factories. He got in last quarter, and he got in the third quarter of 2022. He got out last quarter. So like one 3 months, very short-term trade, which is unusual for Warren Buffett. So I'm sure his views has a little bit changed regarding the China-Taiwan relations. So we have our own view as well, and happy to share later. And I claim no expertise. I'm not a military expert. I'm not a geopolitical expert by training. I was history, international studies major back in college, but my main job is to invest, and we're really thinking everything from investment perspective. And happy to chat about that later. And I'll introduce
You just also, you're doing your research. You also were in Japan and Korea.
Yes, I was in. So before Christmas, I was part of the Asian Society and part of the board here in New York, and we had Asian Society's annual conference in Tokyo right before Christmas. The Japan host gave us very good treatment. So not only we met a lot of allocators and business people there, including some of the semiconductor companies in Japan, but also a lot of the key policymakers. So defense minister was there, chief of staff was there, the Tokyo government was there, and they were very honest in sharing some of their perspectives on how Japan might react to potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and how that will guide their investments in both Asia and US. And, I was a bit shocked. Their tone was very hawkish. Obviously that's a new administration in Japan. And obviously you saw right after Christmas, they announced they're going to double their military spending by 100%. So to 2% of GDP per year. And most incremental amount will be going towards, countering China really in the next decade. So happy to chat more there as well. I'll let Daniel introduce herself. Daniel actually went to college with me a long time ago, and she used to run the Sovereign Wealth Fund practice at BlackRock. So she's very close to a lot of the Asian sovereign wealth, big sovereign wealth fund clients, and now she runs a multifamily office platform and very plugged into a lot of the great entrepreneurs and great allocators in Asia, and she will be happy to share her views from their perspectives in Asia.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Rob, for the invitation. My name is Daniel Wang. For the first interaction with the rest of the group joining in. Same as Rob, I also was born and raised in China. came to the US first to attend Yale. And after graduation, I worked most of my career at BlackRock. And went through the last financial crisis because I joined the industry in 2008. So saw the tremendous growth of asset management as an industry in general, not just in the US, but across the world. And at the time, I was managing most of the central bank sovereign wealth fund and national pensions relationship, primarily with Asia, but also Middle East and Europe. And in 2017, I briefly become an entrepreneur. I actually started a platform that focused on career development for international talents. And a lot of it are international students and young professionals from China originally, and working in the US, UK, and Australia. So my whole career has a lot to do with cross-border dynamics. And after exiting a portion of my shares in Series C funding of that company, I started my current firm, Unigrow Capital. In the beginning, I was actually focused on advising some of the emerging managers, especially in venture growth equity space in China that have US dollar vehicles in terms of cross-border deal advisory as well as international LP engagement. So if we think back to 2016 up until 2018, 2019 stage, there's still a lot of international capital flow going into China. And there's a lot of money made in that generation of investors as well. I'm sure all of us family offices have friends in endowments and foundations. And that was a period of time, a lot of capital concentrated to China, yes.
And it shifted.
It definitely has shifted. We have witnessed a regime change in the last couple of years, which is why my firm also pivoted our model quite significantly to really focus on working closely with some of the larger, especially newer family offices out of Asia, some with roots in China, but mostly with their investment vehicles offshore in Hong Kong, Singapore, other parts of offshore entities, with the focus of investing primarily in North America and providing that global access to Asian-based family offices.
Ask the question. What you've heard what Stephen presented, typical Stephen style, he sort of throws you, he's very Socratic, puts out these are the scenarios, these are the factors. And Han, we've talked, like, you don't think there's gonna be a full, combat invasion. What do you see? What are the likely scenarios?
I'll let you start because I joined a little bit late, so I did not hear directly from Steve, but happy to offer my perspectives.
I'm not a political expert either. I also evaluate situation most from an investment perspective. And I just want to remind everybody come into this discussion with our own biases and preferences and the way we grow up, the information we're exposed to. My assessment is that at least in the near term, there's zero chance of war. I would argue that as sophisticated investors, we need to differentiate what is a political rhetoric and what is covered in the media versus the day-to-day reality. And I think the fact that President Xi has secured the third term and the pressure of proving himself or a regime to the rest of the population in mainland China. And that pressure actually has subdued, given he kind of have already win in his own sense. There is no immediate pressure to make another strong stance of actually invasion of any sort. And I would argue that both from a China and US perspective, people need to think more at a deeper level. What is the driver behind certain political rhetoric? And from a China perspective, yes, every single person who actually grew up in China, and I agree with what Joe said on the other side of the call, that every single Chinese person might grow up thinking that Taiwan is part of China. And it has been the case since President Mao. And there's no actual action of actually launching a war. It is just pre-existing thinking in kind of the culture and philosophy and ideology of China that is part of mainland China. So part of what I was thinking is that in the current political regime, that yes, there's a lot of uncertainty and conflict within China. So from a political perspective, there is incentive for the current administration from China to direct some of the tension externally, be it about the US, be it about Taiwan, and the same challenge may be going on in the US as well. So from a political and media perspective, and we see it in the history of nation state that there's an incentive for the politicians to direct some of the attention to outside of their own regime. But that aside, the actual action of what the politicians are doing between the two nations, I don't necessarily think that a war is going to happen in the near term at all. And a few of the folks mentioned about Ukraine, and I think the events that happened leading to the Russian-Ukraine war and the international view of the power differential between Russia and Ukraine is very different versus how the international view of what China should be doing against Taiwan or what even the US should be kind of navigating the current landscape. So especially given the international response to Ukraine and international view of Russia these days, there's actually even less incentive for China to take severe stances given where people stand now. And the other thing I want to mention is regardless of the political rhetoric, there's very strong economic and trading ties between mainland China and Taiwan, as well as US or Canada and Taiwan, as well as mainland China. So if a war is to happen, people need to consider the consequences of what is going to happen to the three most largest economy of the world, namely the US, China, as well as Japan. And regardless of the political rhetoric, I think the day-to-day trading activity continue to happen. If you ask any ordinary US person in terms of what kind of apps they have been downloading in the last couple of years during COVID, they're probably going to mention Shein, as well as recently Temu, which is actually a subsidiary under Pinduoduo PDD, which is also a Chinese company, e-commerce company listed in the US stock exchange. Listed in the US at least.
Yeah, we're sure over that.
So part of me was thinking that as much of there's a political dynamics going on, there's politician making certain argument with the intention of portraying a perceived image, and there's a intention of leverage behind that perceived image. There's also the actual day-to-day ties of trading. Yeah, that is where I see from an investment perspective. And sorry, the last comment I wanted to make is that that being said, I think from an investment perspective, both from US family offices and Asian or Chinese origin family offices, people think about safety, liquidity, and returns as they think about investment decisions going forward. Previously, people were probably more attracted to returns, but nowadays, especially given the geopolitical tension, people are more so focused on safety and liquidity. There's a reason why a lot of family offices with China origin are now looking into US-oriented investment, as well as more global diversification, which makes my job very interesting. And I think there's a lot of Asian or China family offices with offshore vehicles has very strong incentive to compare notes with US families or asset managers or growth equity investors in general to achieve better access and investment opportunities globally.
I'll share my view later, but first I'll share because I was in Japan, I was in Korea right before Christmas. I obviously have a lot of contacts in Taiwan. I'll share their perspective first for your benefit. Mm-hmm. From a Japanese government's perspective, they're very hawkish, aka they think the war is going to happen not next year, but things that's going to likely in the next 5 years before she finishes the third term. And that's because they think, look, she got impressed with population. And so far, like the GDP growth can never go back to 5% anymore. If you do 2-3% per year, that's already very good. China's becoming another Japan, becoming Japan like back in the 90s. So Japan thinks that to impress the population, the easier thing to do is do something outside economic arena, and Taiwan becomes like very immediate, like obvious target. Obviously, the Japanese government is thinking from their very biased view, because remember, this current administration in Japan is very hawkish and very pro-military. And they, if you have that layout, the argument, hey, look, China's going to do something in Taiwan within the next 5 years, and obviously that gives us more urge to increase military spending right now, right? We're going to double our budget right now. So they're coming from that angle. So that's the Japanese government's perspective. The Koreans, I was in Korea. Korea feel very, very calm, very relaxed. They don't think it's going to happen. And I think the other reason they feel very calm is that they think even if it happens, it's actually a benefit for Korea. Why? For two primary reasons. Korea right now, as of right now, has probably become the third largest weapon exporter globally. This entire Ukrainian war thing has been a fantastic thing for the military industrial complex. So the Hyundai heavy industries, which they produce Hyundai cars, but also they have a military arm that produces a lot of the shells. So right now, a lot of the shells the Ukraine is using, that's really coming from Korea. So U.S. will place an order, get from Korea, and so basically Korean get to make the money. But at the same time, they don't piss off the Russians because they say, well, it's really not my shell. Right? It's like U.S. shell, we're just manufacturing for them in Korea. So if there's another war, that's actually fantastic for the industry there. They're very happy about that. But secondly, for the semiconductor perspective, they feel very happy. So it's a bad for the overall industry. So if there's an invasion, China sends a bunch of missiles to completely destroy TSMC's fabs in Taiwan. In the first few days, or maybe the first week, every semiconductor stock will come down. Samsung's probably come down 30-50%. But in the following 3 weeks, Samsung can double, because people are going to wake up and realize there are two major fabs globally. TSMC has 60% of market share, Samsung's 40%. Now the 60% is gone. Like we're the only game left in town. That's
the
it.
US trying to.
Yes, TSMC, they're trying to build their fab in US. It's a very slow, very long process. And from a cost competitive perspective, it would never get there. It would never get on par with Asia, not in the next decade. It's a very long process. So yes, they may have a little bit in the US, but the headquarters gets smashed, like Samsung becomes the only game in town. So Samsung, first week would come down 50%, and the following 3 weeks is going to double. So Koreans feel very relaxed on that. But Taiwan, I would say, I think most of my friends in Taiwan feel like what then you'd explain, they do not anticipate there's like a real hot war. They think the worst going to happen is be blockade, but China will not, because like if you destroy the island, like the Russians smash Bakhmut into the ground, there's nothing left. Like, okay, sure, you captured the island, but you destroy a bunch of population and destroy all the assets, and what do you get? That's the Taiwan perspective. They think that Beijing will think rationally, and that's why they feel relatively more relaxed right now. Now I'm going to offer my perspectives. Now I'm not saying I don't know whether it's going to happen, will happen or not, will happen this year or in 5 years, in 10 years. I will have like a bunch of scenarios. The key assumption under all the three scenarios is that so far she dictates every single major policy decision, and he can change his mind like very quickly. So if you look back at the zero COVID thing, he literally did like 180 without, preparing the propaganda. He just literally changed his mind. Like, I've been doing zero COVID for 3 years, and okay, I realized this is not a good thing to do. I'm going to change my mind. Boom, no more zero COVID. Literally overnight. Literally just changed completely. And now last week he hosted a big conference in Beijing in which he said, look, we achieved fantastic results, both for the zero COVID in the last 3 years and also the reversal policy. And there's just no shame. So that tells you he can decide something pretty quickly and will get executed. So the term from zero COVID, from opening up overnight, there's no resistance. Like literally everybody just executes. He provides some policy instruction, everybody just executes. So I think, when it comes to Taiwan, it will be something like that. Like he will decide everything. Now, from his consideration, I would say there are three scenarios. Immediate war or hot war or blockade that really did come from Taiwan perspective, Taiwan's initiative. So let's say tomorrow, the Taiwan government says, we declare independence. She will be forced to respond. If he does not respond, he will lose his legitimacy. Because as Daniel told you guys, I think, we discussed a little bit last time, even for people who moved overseas and, have their second and third generation, the first generation older Turkish, like, of course, Taiwan is part of China, like what you're talking about, of course. So 99.9% of Chinese people who live in China, including all my relatives, all my friends there, including Daniel's relatives, including a lot of the Chinese people who since moved overseas to Vietnam, to US, to other places. 99.9% of them think that Taiwan is part of China. And for the last 1,000 years is part of China. So if Taiwan declared, okay, we're an independent country, and she doesn't do anything, like he will lose legitimacy in China. So he will have to respond. Now, responding could be a blockade, it could be hot war. In that scenario, I actually think most likely chance, if it's immediate, let's say Taiwan declared independence tomorrow or next week, blockade is probably the easiest option. Because to launch a full-scale invasion, and remember it's an island, it's not Ukraine, most of the result will be decided by the Navy and the Air Force and not the Army. To prepare for that invasion across the strait, that takes time. That takes a lot of time to prepare. You cannot just say, hey, I want to do that tomorrow, let's do that next week. You can't. So blockade, that's probably the most likely scenario. But let's say in 5 years, and when she feels, okay, my Navy and my Air Force are pretty ready, as for now, I can only transport probably 2-3 brigades. So roughly 3,000 people in one way to Taiwan. That's not enough. You probably need 10x the transport capacity to do that. But let's say in 5-10 years, if you have enough transportation capacity, then he might launch the full scale invasion if Taiwan declares independence. Now, why would Taiwan do that? It's irrational for Taiwan government to do that unless there's a tacit green light from the U.S. government. I don't think, I'll tell you this, 99% I don't think the White House will ever allow Taiwan to do that without explicit, green light or approval from the White House. Now, the party who's not in the White House might really encourage them to do that. But I think the White House will be very careful giving that green light to say, we're independent. Now, the other two scenarios move from Xi's initiative. So let's say Taiwan said, all right, fine, just de facto, we are de facto independent, but we never say we're independent, okay? Just let's stay status quo, everybody's happy. Now, from Xi's perspective, the only two scenarios I think where he will actually decide to invade are either the economy goes so bad, there's a huge internal crisis going on. People don't have jobs, a lot of people, young people on the street protesting. And, he might view, okay, invasion of Taiwan, that's something that can, improve his rating, especially among young people, because as we discussed, 99.9% of people, if there's one thing can unify the Chinese population, they might disagree on zero COVID, on the US, or whatever. This is one thing that unites the entire nation. If he says, hey, let's invade Taiwan, 99.9% of people will say, oh, yes, and let's go do it. So that will be an act of desperation to distract the focus from economy or whatever to the Taiwan invasion. The second scenario will be that we be playing from a position of strength. Let's say, and that's why I don't think it's going to happen immediately, because now he's relatively young. He's not even 70, close to 70. So he can be healthy and be running the country for the next 15 years, easily. But let's say for the next 10 years, decade or 15 years, the country goes very well, the GDP goes up to 30% from now, and feels like, all right, I've done well enough. I now want to be replaced Chairman Mao, because Chairman Mao's picture is still on Tiananmen Square. Okay, I've done fantastic stuff. I'm a great leader, but from a historical stats perspective, I'm still one tier below Chairman Mao. I'm higher than everybody else, but below him. I want to be higher than Chairman Mao. How do I do that? How do I replace his picture with my picture on Tiananmen Square? Unification of Taiwan. That'd be the one thing. That'd be one critical thing. If he completes that task, then he has a legitimate reason to say, all right, let's move Chairman Mao's picture and put my picture there. Because now I have strong proof I'm better than him. So that'd be from the point of strength.
we'll put some other questions, but it sounds like blockade is an easier thing to implement. Play that out. What are the responses of the various sides to a blockade?
There's nothing Taiwan can do, really. It really comes doan to what Japan and US are going to do. I think it's going to be very tricky. It'll be basically like when the United States blockade Cuba, and what's the Soviet Union's response? Soviet Union tried to, like poke US and obviously it was like 13 days, very intense discussion, right? And US is like, look, if you get in, we're going to shoot you. And Soviet Union is like, I'm going to get closer and closer and test it. And obviously there's a lot of backdoor discussion going on in 13 days. So eventually both sides reach a compromise and backed off, right? US say, okay, well, I'm going to move my missile from Turkey and you got to agree to move your missiles from Cuba. And we removed the blockade. That was it. Now, when mainland China blockades Taiwan, US would need to respond for sure. It will make they would definitely send the ships, I think, over there, and there will be a lot of backdoor discussion going on behind the door. So it might take 13 days, might take longer, but then who knows? I don't know. Hopefully they would reach agreement, sort of some of compromise, or it's like, all right, U.S. will force Taiwan to withdraw their declarations. All right, sorry, that was a wrong declaration. Remain quote unquote part of China, like basically go back to de facto scenario. So that's my thinking.
So now, Rob had a question. Peter, you had an original question.
Yeah, can I have my question is, first of all, very helpful, especially from the Chinese perspective, people on the mainland. What's the perspective of the people in Taiwan? We saw what happened earlier this year with Afghanistan, where they basically laid down. We saw a much different scenario in Ukraine, where they basically stood up and they're fighting the Russians. So the Chinese people, will they fight? Will they kind of stand up for that?
I don't know a lot of young people in Taiwan. All my contacts are basically business people who have very close working relationship with China, because the Taiwan economy is this very symbiotic working relationship with China, because a lot of the companies, semiconductor companies, they have a huge amount of assets and staff in China. So from their perspective, they're definitely anti-independence. They will think, they were basically say, for them, and this is from their very selfish perspective, status quo is the best. Status quo is the best because we basically enjoy, all the benefits as an independent country. Our passport can go to many, many different parts of the world. It's much better, actually better than US passport. At the same time, we can make a lot of money together with China. And as long as our government will not go crazy and declare a formal independence, they don't view there's a huge risk medium term that China's going to do something about it. So they view, okay, status quo, we're de facto independent, but we never declare independence. That's the best because the US will be happy. China so far, mainland China so far will be okay with that. And we, the senior business leaders in Taiwan, that's the best scenario for us. We're relatively safe and we can make a lot of money, continue to.
Thank you.
I think Rob had a question next.
Thanks. Rob Colorina. I am of Asian descent, but Southeast Asian descent, so sort of a hybrid here, and a couple of you guys are long friends. My question is with respect to Chinese investors outbound. Are you all seeing more movement towards liquidity and the flexibility of liquidity? Just around the corner here, real estate was along, if you look at the Waldorf Astoria, that was Ambang Insurance and then the like. I was curious, are you seeing more play into that that are less CFIUS driven type of positions?
Daniel, you probably know that better, but I'll tell, I have a few clients from Asia, Asian family offices. First of all, CFIUS, anything highly sensitive like tech, semiconductor or AI, there's simply no way they can invest. So they're not even thinking about that. So we want to invest in those, AI or biotech or a lot of semiconductor technology here in the US. We cannot because we have to go through a CFIUS process and we don't think we can win. So we just forget about it. Now, so from a traditional family office perspective, they're really thinking from a geo asset allocation perspective. It's less about liquidity. So it's like, look, I'm an entrepreneur in China. It's nothing to do with Taiwan, but like she's like economic policy. He basically grew me as a pig for 2 years. I'm fat enough, he will kill me. And then if I don't get killed, he'll give me some fee. I grow for another 2-3 years. I grow fat again. He'll kill me again. So if I make money, I'll just move it overseas, like Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, maybe first stop to North America. Especially if I speak English, especially my second generation. You're educated in the West and speak English. It was much easier. First stop.
Han wants to.
I just want to have a question also.
Sure. First stop is always real estate. That's just like in their mindset. When I go to a new place, I always have one piece of real estate first. That's always first stop. After I secure that piece of real estate, then I think about private, public, other asset classes. But first stop is always real estate.
Actually, Amy, you had a question.
I did, yeah. Hi, Amy Erickson with EK Equities, a banker that works closely with Mark. The last comment is particularly relevant because I actually spent a lot of time in China in my prior life working in the EB5 industry, which is a niche, you probably are familiar, it's a kind of a niche industry where foreign investors invest in US companies or jobs, a lot of real estate. That's sort of what I worked on, traveling to China to these roadshows to raise money from EB5 investors on behalf of United States developers, some senior living. I worked for a company called Greystone, but this is all backdrop to my question, which is how does Hong Kong kind of play into this? And I ask that because I would go to Hong Kong because there were issues with getting money out of China. Families would wire money from China to Hong Kong, and spending time in both mainland and Hong Kong felt just taking the bridge from Shenzhen to Hong Kong. When you get there, it just felt different. And we saw in the last few years this drive for independence in Hong Kong, and I'm wondering if you see like there being some sort of support from the Hong Kong residents with Taiwan if things were to escalate, or just how that the Hong Kong piece fits into this discussion.
Well, you're a former banker, I'm sure. You just have a lot of contacts there. A lot of my contacts, the Hong Kong bankers already moved to Singapore.
Right.
Because basically follow the clients and follow the money. I would say post 1819, I was there in Hong Kong during the height of the protest. I didn't go for the protest, but it just happened. I was there. I think after that, a lot of the Chinese money who were based in Hong Kong, they decided like, look, it's not like safe enough. Let's move to Singapore. So no, I would say 100% of money already moved to Singapore, but it's a huge chunk. And because the money moved to Singapore, all the service providers, tax advisors, your brokers, your bankers, a lot of them actually moved to Singapore because all the clients moved there. Then you go to Singapore quite often. So
most of the young people move to London and to Canada and to the US.
Most young people don't live there anyways, because they're not a Chinese passport holder. When they're young, their kids send them to US or Europe for school, and they pretty much they stay there. They stay in the US, stay in London, and just go on their own business or their own life. So.
Yeah, historically, a lot of the offshore capital is in Hong Kong because Hong Kong was viewed as an international center, and geographic proximity to China make it very easy. But in recent years, people obviously were worried about the true independence of their capital. So a lot of that capital has moved to Singapore. But Singapore obviously provide easier access to Southeast Asia, but in terms of actual investment opportunities and width and depth of capital markets is yet to be grown. So a lot of people will have a base in Singapore, but their ultimate investment destination is either still across Southeast Asia, or they're coming to the US, North America, or to Europe as well. So I do think from a talent pipeline perspective, a lot of those are still in Hong Kong. We're now sitting across Hong Kong and Singapore. But given Hong Kong, unfortunately, for the last 3 years of zero COVID policy was also directly related to what China mainland was doing. So a lot of events and I guess larger scale activity has also moved to Singapore. But I do think for Chinese families that haven't already moved their portion of their asset offshore, going forward, it could be very difficult to continue to move capital offshore. And sorry, quickly to Rob's comment on liquidity. So if we're talking about China, especially mainland China, family offices or ultra high net worth individuals, they have always been more short-term driven. And also when people think about investment opportunities in domestic in China, people think about real estate, public equity, and to some extent venture, and that's it. And there's less of a derivative instrument when it comes to public equity or hedge fund trading strategies. There's not as much of a private credit or other exotic ways of investment opportunities. There's less of a variety of asset classes or investment approaches in general. So there's a big learning curve when they think about overseas allocation and truly diversify their investment allocation. So I think there's a lot to be learned as these investors going overseas. But I do think a lot of them are being educated by advisors or other third-party providers about if they want to move overseas, and they need to really adapt international standard of investment, and they need to think about more long-term horizon and not always thinking about 1 or 2 year investment horizon. When Asian, especially Chinese family offices, they allocate overseas, historically, a lot of them were allocated to private equity or venture capital funds. But when it comes to public equity, a lot of the times the family office owners or their in-house teams may have pretty strong opinions on what stocks to select. But in the last couple of years, public equity dynamic also changed a lot. A lot of these in-house or owners of the families realized they are not necessarily professionally trained to actually invest in public equity market longer term. So I think there's a recent trend of
Doing really
allocating
well
to.
for several years, like everybody.
Yeah. So in recent years, they started to truly think about more different investment strategies when it comes to public equity, especially in the hedge fund space. So there's more of an appetite to allocate as well.
Han, did you want to?
Yeah, I just have to Amy's question is the Chinese family office, is this, especially if they're not related to the government, are they still able to get their money out?
So I know brokers who do basically the two ways. The large amount of, if you own a large amount of money, and typically the broker will work inside the government system and basically fill itself with the government SOE trading co. So they basically have a budget and you basically tag along. Obviously you got to bribe the right people, and basically, your 50 million is big money for you, but it's tiny for the SOE trading company. So you basically tag along there to get your money out. That's more a complicated way, and obviously you got to pay higher commission for that. So that's one way to do it. And obviously the broker needs to have a very solid relationship inside these large SOE trading co to do that. The other way is basically what they call the matching service, which is a high risk for the client. But if they want to move small amount, it might make sense. So basically, they set up accounts in mainland, right? So you wire me 10 million RMB, which is roughly 1 or 2 million USD. And for your account in the US, I'm gonna wire you, basically the same time, same minute. Now, obviously, you're taking the risk. You need to trust me, because there's no guarantee.
But no paper trail, though.
There's no paper trail.
Yeah, exactly.
You need first wire me the RMB, and then I wire you the USD to your account.
Wire me first.
Yeah, but you wire me first, yeah. But yes, you do own the rest, that you wire me your RMB, and I just disappear. I'm not gonna wire you the USD. So people typically, when they do that, it's only a small amount. So it's like, okay, fine, I lose 1 million. That's fine. I'm willing to do the rest. But so you need more level of trust there. So those are two ways.
Yeah, because I don't know the Chinese, but I think if you wire RMB, doesn't matter how much money, if it's as long as it's in China.
Within China, it's okay. Within China, it's okay.
They don't track you like in the US. They'll flag you if you go over a certain amount of money.
Yeah, the third avenue back then was through Macau, because we invest a lot of casinos there, through the junket business. But the casino business stayed. Every US firm got their license renewal. There's been a huge concern in the last 2 years. That episode is done, but all junkets industry has been killed. So that channel has been cut off.
I don't know if you remember, you want to?
I want to add to the third
Yeah,
point
please.
because I lived in Beijing for several years and I'm very lucky to know like two Princetons, like they were the grandsons of the founding top 5 guys of China. They were in that business too, like they have Bitcoins, so they do things on a privileged way. They have all the licenses.
Well, yeah, my question was non-connection to the government, right? Yeah. So there's right before COVID, I know a guy that basically bought jewelry in China and he takes gold to be exact, and he takes it to Hong Kong and he melted it. That's his way to.
Yeah, and there are people who do paintings as well. You know, like go to the auction house, like spend a huge amount for some painting, and then you sell it overseas.
Right.
Then you can basically immediately sell it, right? Because like the painting never left the Freeport in Holland. You just immediately sell to that person. That's how you get your money out.
The other one too is visitor that come from Singapore or wherever to China. They wear fake jewelry because they have cameras everywhere, and when they leave with real jewelry too. So that's
Or watch.
That's a great one.
That's a lot easier, right?
yeah, but it's a lot of.
But still, that's like a small amount. You can't move like 50 million like
So
that.
the question is, with all this transfer money, if you have to invest in funds or whatever, how does the KYC process work?
We are trying, right? You have to have money in Singapore or.
No, because the money is transferred, right? Because at the end of the day, bankers do KYC and stuff like that. And if you're investing in a private equity fund or venture capital fund, they have to do their own KYC. So how does that whole thing work?
Honestly, in my experience, yeah, the families that I end up working with are typically those who have generated their wealth offshore. For example, they had taken a company public in Hong Kong or the
Yeah, no, I wasn't talking about that because there you can do a clean KYC, but I'm talking about the other way of transporting money.
For the recent people who have not moved their money, that could be an issue.
Yeah.
But typically, you know, like our clients are people who have done that like decades ago. So now they're completely fine. But if all your money are still stuck in China, you're just doing that recently, that could be an issue.
So a couple things. We have some questions, but we also have food. Those who are here.
Yeah.
Steve? So Stephen, you want to just announce what the plan is on food?
Yeah, some food. If you go out and around the corner here, there's a small conference room. Just grab a plate. The coffee is in the kitchen, right out the door there, and we have sodas here. So help yourself.
But if you're a speaker, you can't go. Some questions. So
Adam had a question for one.
Adam Block, you were first up. Go. What's your question? You're on mute, you know.
Yes. First, Stephen, thank you so much for all your presentations. 150. Congratulations.
Thanks, Adam.
Be proud that Trump is proud of you too.
And there were two ways that could go. That was one of the bad ones.
My question, wonderful discussion, really very interesting. The comparisons, Taiwan, Ukraine, what have you. My question is about the electrification of China. And there's a EV company, BYD, that seems to be growing very quickly, overtaking Tesla in terms of in the volume of EVs that they've sold this past year. I'd like to hear some thoughts on that company. They have factories all over the world, not just in China, and they also own a battery factory. I think it's called FinDreams. I'm not. Correct me if I'm wrong. But their focus in this particular sector is quite interesting and growing quite fast. And I would like to hear the thoughts from the Chinese experts, Chinese mainland experts on this. Thank you.
First? No. So we invest, we're not investing in BYD, we're an investor in pure battery play called CATL, which is the largest competitor to BYD. So BYD history, as you guys know, BYD was, it still is, Warren Buffett is one of the core China portfolio companies that was invested by Li Lu, who's very close to Munger and and Warren Buffett. So BYD's like history was really a cell phone. So they do cell phone batteries. 2 decades ago, that's what the core. But obviously, it's a fantastic entrepreneur, and he wanted to do something more ambitious and start doing cars and doing car batteries. In terms of technology, it wasn't the best. So it was second to CATL, and that's why we invested in CATL. Because CATL was still the leader in terms of NCM battery, which is more higher energy density, higher efficiency car battery or EV batteries. But BYD has a few advantages that they really push to the limit, have done very well because they have a cash flow business, because they still do this. They still do cell phone batteries and computer batteries. So that's generating a lot of cash flow. And 2, they already have a gasoline car business, which is actually not a ton of growth, and they're a small player, but it does generate cash flow. So they redirected cash flow into improving their battery technology and closing that gap between themselves and CATL. So I would say there's still a gap, but the gap has been a lot smaller or a lot closer versus like a couple of years ago. So now they're a legit player that now they can even supply to Tesla, Tesla's China factories. And because they're vertically integrated, they have experience manufacturing cars at scale, and plus they supply their own battery. And that put in a big advantage, not just over Tesla, but also over the other Chinese EV startups. So those are 3 guys that are actually way ahead of BYD when they first started. But they're very small. They're all subscale. They do manufacture their batteries. So all the 3 companies, NIO, Xiaopeng, and the other guy, they're still losing money right now because they're still subscale and they had to buy batteries from either BYD or CATL. Versus BYD, now they actually can turn cash flow positive because they can hit the scale pretty quickly. So they're getting massive market share in China. But I would say for the Chinese EV market, the penetration is already over 30%. So going from 30% to 50%, that growth rate has come down significantly for everybody, not just for BYD, but for BYD, the 3 startups from Tesla. So it's getting, the competition is getting more intense because everybody's cutting price. So everybody's suffering from gross margin perspective. So going forward, yes, there's still growth for the market, but moving that penetration from 30 to 50%, that's going to take much longer than taking the penetration from 0 to 30%. So what's interesting, I think a lot of people are not appreciating this right now, is all the Chinese EV companies, including BYD, including the 3 startups, everybody's like moving overseas. And they're not necessarily coming to the US. They're really moving to Southeast Asia because that market so far, there's no competition. Because none of the Asian guys, yes, Toyota, Nissan, and Honda have their EV versions. They're not selling in Southeast Asia. Tesla is really not selling in Southeast Asia. So now it's really, and there's a 0 local competition. So all of the Chinese companies are basically like in free market, and everybody's charging fairly high price. So their gross margin is actually a lot higher, even though Southeast Asian market is smaller versus China, but it's a highly profitable market. The gross margin is like much higher than what they can get in China. So going forward, their playbook, and we spoke with all 4 of you guys recently. Their playbook's like, look, China will still compete. Yes, we're not going to make a lot of gross margin there. So that's really, just keep the market position. But the growth driver going forward, we're really targeting Southeast Asia because there's no competition there. There's only 4 of us Chinese guys, and everybody can make a lot of money there. So that's really the key growth driver.
What's the next company?